Since 1976, the United States has executed more than 1,500 people. Texas accounts for nearly a third of them. No other state comes close. No other state has wrestled so publicly, so painfully, and so repeatedly with the question at the center of it all. Can a government that sometimes gets things wrong be trusted to do something that can never be undone? Execution is permanent. Evidence is not. Inside the Huntsville unit, a red brick building they call the Walls, men and women have been strapped to a gurney, administered a lethal cocktail, and declared dead by a physician while the state watched. Some of them were monsters. Some of them may have been innocent. Some of them changed American law forever. Some of them changed nothing at all, and that silence is its own kind of verdict. These are the 10 executions that defined a state, divided a nation, and in some cases may never be forgotten for all the wrong reasons. What you are about to hear is not fiction. Every case in this documentary is drawn from public court records, documented witness testimony, investigative journalism, and the official statements of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The crimes described were real. The victims were real. The condemned were real. Some of these executions were carried out against individuals whose guilt was never seriously disputed. Others involve lingering, serious questions about whether the state of Texas killed the right person at all. We will not pretend otherwise. We will not look away. In a democracy, the death penalty is carried out in the name of the people. That means these cases belong to all of us. This is the story of 10 of them. Number 10, Charlie Brooks, Jr., executed December 7, 1982. He didn't die because he was the worst. He didn't die because his crime was the most horrific on record. Charlie Brooks, Jr. died because someone had to be first. And on December 7, 1982, that someone was him. He became the first human being in modern history to be executed by lethal injection. Every execution carried out by that method since, and there have been more than 1,000, traces its lineage back to the gurney Charlie Brooks was strapped to in Huntsville, Texas. The crime itself was terrible, though not unusual by death row standards. In November 1976, Brooks and his associate, Woody Loudris, kidnapped David Gregory, a 26-year-old mechanic. Gregory had agreed to let the two men test drive a car at a Fort Worth used car lot where he worked. Instead, they drove him to a motel. He was found there with a bullet in his head. Who pulled the trigger was never definitively established. Both Brooks and Loudris were charged. Loudris accepted a plea deal. He received a life sentence. Brooks went to trial, was convicted of capital murder, and was sentenced to death. 2 men, 1 gunshot. One walked out of prison. The other walked into history. Brooks appealed for years. His attorneys argued that lethal injection, then untested on humans, constituted cruel and unusual punishment, a violation of the 8th Amendment. The courts disagreed. On December 7th at 12:09 in the morning, they wheeled him into the death chamber. Witnesses later described the execution as startlingly calm compared to the electric chair or gas chamber methods that had preceded it in other states. Brooks appeared to lose consciousness within seconds of the drugs entering his bloodstream. He was pronounced dead at 12:16 a.m. 7 minutes. The state had found its method. The debate his death ignited has never stopped. Medical professionals argued from the start that the 3-drug protocol, a sedative, a paralytic, and potassium chloride to stop the heart, might mask suffering rather than prevent it. If the sedative didn't work properly, a paralyzed person could experience the last 2 drugs as agony and be unable to show it. That argument has wound through American courts for 4 decades. It reaches the Supreme Court periodically. It has never been definitively resolved. His final words were a prayer. "I believe that God, Allah, in His infinite wisdom and mercy, forgives me." He turned toward his girlfriend in the witness room. He mouthed the words, "I love you." Then the drugs went in. David Gregory was 26 years old. He had gone to work that morning to sell cars. He never came home. Charlie Brooks, Jr. did not die with the same anonymity he lived. His death changed the architecture of American capital punishment. Whether that was progress or just a cleaner-looking version of the same irreversible act is a question that 40 years of executions have not answered. History doesn't always remember the right people for the right reasons. Number 9. Karla Faye Tucker, executed February 3, 1998. The Pope asked for her life. Pat Robertson asked for her life. Amnesty International asked for her life. Tens of thousands of people from around the world wrote letters, made phone calls, staged vigils. George W. Bush said no. On February 3, 1998, Karla Faye Tucker became the first woman executed in Texas since 1863. Her case did not just make the news. It reshaped the global conversation about who deserves to die. The crime happened 15 years earlier, in June 1983, and it was savage. Karla Faye Tucker was 23 years old, strung out on a cocktail of drugs and alcohol, when she and her boyfriend, Daniel Garrett, broke into the Houston apartment of Jerry Lynn Dean, a 27-year-old motorcycle mechanic she knew and despised. What followed was an act of violence so brutal that even seasoned homicide detectives struggled to describe it. Tucker used a pickaxe. She struck Dean repeatedly. When she found Deborah Thornton, 32 years old, a woman who happened to be spending the night, hiding under a sheet in the bedroom, Tucker struck her too. According to Tucker's own later account, she experienced a surge of pleasure with each blow. That statement haunted her trial. It was the kind of thing a jury never forgets. Both Tucker and Garrett were convicted. Garrett died in prison before his own execution date arrived. Tucker went to death row. What happened next was not something Texas or anyone had anticipated. Karla Faye Tucker found religion. Not the convenient jailhouse kind that defense attorneys sometimes deploy at sentencing. By nearly all accounts from chaplains, fellow inmates, and corrections officers who knew her over 14 years, her conversion was genuine. She became a minister of sorts on death row. She counseled other inmates. She married a prison minister through the bars of a visitation room. The state of Texas had, in some strange and uncomfortable way, produced exactly the kind of rehabilitated person that rehabilitation is supposed to produce, and then scheduled her for execution anyway. The global media circus surrounding her final weeks was unlike anything seen before or since on death row. Celebrities weighed in. Religious leaders made direct appeals. Tucker herself gave calm, thoughtful television interviews in which she acknowledged her guilt completely and made no argument for her own innocence. She asked only for mercy. Bush, then governor and already eyeing a presidential run, declined. He later wrote that he agonized over the decision. Critics pointed out that he had not exercised clemency for a single death row inmate before Tucker and would not after. On the evening of February 3rd, Tucker was led into the death chamber. Her demeanor, witnesses said, was one of extraordinary peace. She looked at the victim witnesses in the room and expressed sorrow. She looked at her supporters and expressed love. Her final words? "I would like to say to all of you, the Thornton family and Jerry Dean's family, that I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this." She was pronounced dead at 6:45 p.m. The question her case raised was not whether she deserved to be punished. She committed those murders. The question was whether a person who has genuinely, profoundly changed is the same person who committed the crime. Texas answered that question on February 3, 1998. It answered it with a needle. Whether that answer was justice or just law is something we are still arguing about today. Number 8. Kenneth McDuff, the Broomstick Killer, executed November 17, 1998. There is a unique category of horror reserved for what happens when a system fails spectacularly and people die because of it. Kenneth McDuff is the only person in American criminal history to have his death sentence commuted, be released on parole, and then be sentenced to death a second time for murders he committed while free. Read that again. The state of Texas almost executed him, let him go instead, and then watched him kill again. In August 1966, McDuff and an accomplice abducted 3 teenagers near Fort Worth: Robert Brand, 17, Marcus Dunham, 16, and Brand's girlfriend, Edna Sullivan, 16. The 2 boys were shot. Edna Sullivan was raped and murdered. McDuff was 19 years old. He was convicted and sentenced to death. But in 1972, the Supreme Court's Furman v. Georgia decision effectively halted executions across the country, and McDuff's sentence, along with hundreds of others, was commuted to life in prison. Then came the part that defies belief. In 1989, despite a documented history of prison violence, parole board recommendations against release, and the vigorous objection of law enforcement officials who knew his file, Kenneth McDuff was paroled. The Texas prison system was under a federal court order to reduce overcrowding. McDuff walked out. What followed was a killing spree that lasted until 1992. The confirmed victims include Colleen Reed, a 28-year-old accountant abducted from a car wash in Austin on a December night in 1991, and Melissa Northrup, a 22-year-old pregnant convenience store clerk who vanished from her job in Waco in 1992. Reed's body was never recovered. Northrup was found in a gravel pit. There were others. The total number of women McDuff killed after his parole is believed to be at least 9. He was caught, tried twice, and sentenced to death both times. In court, McDuff was cold. He showed no remorse. He smiled at inappropriate moments. Those who prosecuted him described a man who seemed genuinely indifferent to the fact that other human beings had suffered and died at his hands. His execution in November 1998 prompted the Texas legislature to overhaul the state's parole system. Background reports would be reviewed more carefully. Violent offenders would be harder to release. It was a reform built on the bodies of women who didn't have to die. McDuff's final words were essentially non-existent. He offered a brief statement thanking his attorneys and said he was at peace. He gave no acknowledgement of his victims, no apology to the families watching him die. He was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m. The families of his victims had waited more than a decade for that moment. Several of them were there. They watched, and then they went home. to the rest of their lives, which had been irreparably altered by a decision made by a parole board that no longer exists in the form it once took. The system failed Colleen Reed. It failed Melissa Northrup. It failed all of them. Kenneth McDuff was evil, but he was an evil the system put back on the street. That is the part that should keep us awake. Number 7. Cameron Todd Willingham, executed February 17, 2004. A man walked into the death chamber in Huntsville on a February morning in 2004, and many of the people who put him there now believe he should not have died. That is not an anti-death penalty talking point. It is a conclusion drawn from a forensic review commissioned by the state of Texas itself. On December 23, 1991, a fire destroyed the Willingham home in Corsicana, Texas. Cameron Todd Willingham's 3 daughters, Amber, 2 years old, and twins Carmen and Cameron, 1 year old, died in the blaze. Willingham escaped. His neighbors later reported that he seemed agitated outside, that he did not attempt to re-enter the burning house to save the children. Fire investigators concluded the fire had been deliberately set. They pointed to burn patterns, accelerant indicators, and the behavior of the fire itself as evidence of arson. Willingham, they determined, had killed his own daughters. He maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest, until the moment the drugs entered his veins. Here is where this case breaks open. In the years following his conviction, the science of fire investigation itself was subjected to serious academic scrutiny. Researchers found that many of the so-called indicators of arson that investigators had relied on for decades, particular burn patterns, charring characteristics, the behavior of glass, were not reliable scientific markers at all. They were folklore, dressed up as forensics. In 2004, just weeks before Willingham's execution date, a prominent fire scientist named Gerald Hurst reviewed the evidence in the case and submitted a report to the governor's office. His conclusion? There was no credible scientific evidence that the fire had been set intentionally. Governor Rick Perry received that report. He did not delay the execution. After Willingham's death, the Texas Forensic Science Commission launched its own investigation. A nationally recognized fire expert, Craig Byler, reviewed the evidence and reached a similar conclusion. Before he could testify before the commission, Perry replaced key members of the panel. The investigation was restructured. Its findings were narrowed. Perry called Willingham a monster in a press conference. He pointed to the testimony of a jailhouse informant who claimed Willingham had confessed. That informant later suggested his testimony may have been influenced by promises of leniency for his own case. Willingham's final words were addressed to his ex-wife, who had divorced him during his time on death row and who believed he was guilty. He told her, "The monster you created doesn't exist." He told the state of Texas, "I am an innocent man convicted of a crime I did not commit." 3 little girls died in that fire on December 23, 1991. Their deaths deserve justice. The question that haunts this case, the question that may never be definitively answered, is whether Cameron Todd Willingham was responsible for those deaths, or whether he was a grieving father destroyed twice. First by the fire, and then by the state. If he was innocent, the state of Texas did not make a mistake. It made a choice. It received evidence that should have given it pause, and it proceeded anyway. Permanent, irreversible, final. Number 6. Angel Maturino Resendiz, the railroad killer, executed June 27, 2006. The FBI put him on their 10 most wanted list. Border Patrol deported him. He walked back in. They deported him again. He walked back in again. Between 1997 and 1999, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz rode American freight trains from city to city, dropped off near houses that caught his attention, and killed the people inside. By conservative estimates, he murdered at least 15 human beings. The mechanics of his crimes were defined by proximity and opportunity. Reséndiz traveled by rail. He killed near rail lines. He targeted isolated homes. His victims were not chosen for any consistent characteristic except availability. They included a 39-year-old physician in Kentucky, a pastor's wife in Texas, a university professor and his wife in Illinois. Different states, different victims, minimal physical evidence. The chaos of his geographic range made him extraordinarily difficult to track. Multiple law enforcement agencies in multiple states were investigating murders that none of them initially connected to each other. By the time anyone pieced together the pattern, the body count was climbing. Even after he was identified and added to the FBI's most wanted list, the system couldn't contain him. He crossed the border repeatedly. Border Patrol records confirmed he had been detained and deported from the United States on multiple occasions, including once just days before he killed a couple in Texas. The case broke not through traditional investigation, but through family. Texas Ranger Drew Carter established contact with Resendiz's sister, Manuela Reséndiz, in Mexico. He persuaded her to help negotiate a surrender. She did. In July 1999, Reséndiz walked across the International Bridge at El Paso and turned himself in to Ranger Carter personally. No standoff, no chase. A handshake at a border crossing. He stood trial in Texas for the murder of Dr. Claudia Benton, a 39-year-old pediatric neurologist who had been bludgeoned and stabbed in her Houston home in December 1998. Her husband was a witness in the witness room the day Reséndiz was executed. The defense argued insanity. Reséndiz claimed he heard demonic voices, that he was receiving communications from supernatural forces, that he was commanded to kill. Psychiatrists disagreed about the diagnosis. The jury dismissed the insanity defense in less than 3 hours. He was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, he gave interviews from death row in which he described his killings with a detachment that disturbed even experienced journalists. He spoke about his victims without visible emotion. He spoke about his faith with apparent sincerity. His final words included an apology. He told the family of Claudia Benton, "I want to ask if it is in your heart to forgive me. You don't have to." He expressed hope for reunion with God. He was pronounced dead at 8:05 p.m. Claudia Benton's family was in the room. Her husband, George Benton, had spent 7 years waiting for that moment. He said afterward that he felt peace, but not closure. Those are different things. At least 15 families know what Ángel Reséndiz took from them. The border he crossed so easily, so repeatedly, while on the FBI's most wanted list, is a failure of systems and coordination that the victims of his later crimes paid for with their lives. The railroad that carried him is still there. The homes beside the tracks are still there. He is not. Number 5. John William King, executed April 24, 2019. James Byrd Jr. was 49 years old, a beloved father of 3, and a familiar face in the small East Texas town of Jasper. On the night of June 7, 1998, he accepted a ride from 3 men he knew. It was the last decision he ever made. John William King, Lawrence Russell Brewer, and Sean Berry chained James Byrd to the back of a pickup truck by his ankles. They drove for nearly 3 miles on a logging road. Byrd was conscious for a significant portion of the dragging. His body was torn apart. Forensic evidence indicated he was alive until his head struck a culvert. He was then dumped in front of a black church. The killers were white supremacists. King and Brewer had been radicalized in prison through their membership in the Confederate Knights of America, a white power gang. The murder of James Byrd Jr. was not spontaneous. It was ideological. It was an act of racial terror. King was the ringleader. At trial, he showed no remorse. He was defiant. He flashed what witnesses interpreted as a white power hand sign. He seemed, by all accounts from those who observed him, to believe he had done something worth doing. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Physical evidence connected King and his associates to the crime scene, to the truck, to the dragging itself. The jury convicted King and sentenced him to death in less than 3 hours. The case rippled far beyond Jasper, Texas. In 2009, President Barack Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, expanding federal hate crime law. It was named in part for Byrd. It was a direct legal legacy of what happened on that logging road. James Byrd's family had a complicated relationship with the execution. His daughter, Renee Byrd, stated that she opposed the death penalty even for her father's killers, that it would not bring healing, that it was not what her father would have wanted. His brother, on the other hand, was present at the execution. Different members of the same family, standing on opposite sides of the same argument, united only by their grief. King was executed on April 24, 2019, 20 years and 10 months after James Byrd Jr. was dragged to his death. In the execution chamber, King maintained his defiance to the end. His final words, "Capital punishment, them without the capital get the punishment." He offered no apology. He acknowledged no wrongdoing. He made a rhetorical point about class and justice that would have been intellectually interesting coming from anyone else, and was chilling coming from him. Lawrence Russell Brewer had been executed in 2011. Sean Berry, who was behind the wheel and whose lawyers argued he was not a willing participant in the murder, was sentenced to life in prison and remains incarcerated. James Byrd Jr.'s grave is in Jasper. His family visits. His town has tried, with uneven success, to reckon with what happened there. The logging road where it happened still exists. Some things can be marked. Some things can be memorialized. Some things cannot be undone. John William King knew that better than anyone. Number 4. Charles Victor Thompson, executed February 27, 2026. In 2005, a man on death row for double murder simply walked out of a Houston jail. He was wearing a business suit. He rode an elevator, nodded to a guard, and stepped onto the street a free man. For 10 days, the state of Texas had no idea where he was. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked questions. He just left. Charles Victor Thompson had been convicted of killing his ex-girlfriend Denise Hayslip and her new boyfriend Darren Kane in 1998. The crime was driven by jealousy and rage, the brutal domestic calculus of a man who believed that what he had once possessed remained his. Hayslip was 29, Kane was 28. Thompson shot them both in Hayslip's home. He left them there and attempted to construct an alibi. He was caught, tried, and sentenced to death. He arrived on death row at the Polunsky unit and, like all condemned inmates, waded through years of appeals. The escape happened during a legal visit at the Harris County Jail in Houston in November 2005. Thompson had obtained civilian clothes, a suit, dress shirt, tie, through means that were never fully explained to the public's satisfaction. At some point during his visit, he changed clothes and simply walked out through multiple security checkpoints. The subsequent manhunt crossed international lines. Thompson made it to Mexico. He was apprehended in Nuevo Laredo, just across the border, 10 days after his escape. Mexican authorities handed him back to Texas, and he returned to death row. The escape prompted significant review of security protocols in Texas jails. How exactly Thompson obtained civilian clothing, how he moved through multiple checkpoints unchallenged, how a man sentenced to death for a double murder walked out of a building with armed guards. Those questions were investigated, and the answers were quietly embarrassing to the Harris County Sheriff's Department. Thompson's case moved through decades of appeals after his return. The courts reviewed and rejected his arguments. He was executed on February 27, 2026. He had spent more than 25 years on death row following the murders. The escape stood as a footnote to his case, an almost surreal interlude in a story that otherwise followed the grim procedural path of capital punishment in Texas. His final words expressed gratitude to those who had supported him, acknowledged the pain of the victims' families, and maintained, as he had maintained throughout, that the full truth of what happened on that night in 1998 had not been told. Denise Hayslip and Darren Kane were killed in a house where they should have been safe. They were killed by someone who knew them. That is the truth that does not change regardless of what came after. The man who killed them escaped for 10 days and came back. Justice, when it arrived 26 years late. Whether it arrived correctly, the courts said yes. Thompson said no. And Denise Hayslip and Darren Kane are not here to offer a third opinion. Number 3. Ivan Cantu, executed February 28, 2024. Kim Kardashian posted about his case. Dr. Phil devoted programming to it. A former witness publicly admitted he had lied on the stand. Texas executed Ivan Cantu anyway. The crime occurred in November 2000. James Mosqueda, Cantu's cousin, and Mosqueda's fiancée, Amy Kitchen, were found shot to death in Mosqueda's home in Plano, Texas. Both have been killed execution style. Cantu was identified as a suspect within days. Prosecutors argued he had killed his cousin to steal jewelry he could sell to fund his lifestyle. He was tried, convicted of capital murder, and sentenced to death. For years, Cantu sat on death row, and his case attracted little outside attention. Then, gradually, it did. The first crack appeared when Jeff Reyes, a key prosecution witness who had testified about Cantu's behavior and statements around the time of the murders, began to recant. Not quietly, publicly. Reyes stated in a sworn affidavit that he had lied during the original trial. He said he had testified falsely about conversations he claimed to have had with Cantu. He said his testimony was not truthful. A witness recanting sworn testimony in a capital case is extraordinarily serious. Recantation alone does not guarantee a new trial. Courts scrutinize late recantations, knowing that witnesses sometimes recant under pressure or for other motivations. But when a central witness in a death penalty case publicly states he lied, it is, at minimum, a reason to pause. Cantu's nephew also came forward with testimony suggesting that someone else, not Ivan Cantu, had committed the murders. The family dynamics were complicated, the timeline disputed, but the claims added to a growing body of doubt. Celebrity attention arrived. Kim Kardashian used her platform to raise awareness. Dr. Phil interviewed individuals connected to the case. Social media campaigns reached millions of people. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles received a significant volume of correspondence about the case. The board recommended against clemency. Governor Greg Abbott declined to intervene. On February 28, 2024, Ivan Cantu was executed by lethal injection. He was 47 years old. His final words were measured, loving, and forward-looking. He expressed his love for his family, his faith in God, and his belief that the truth would eventually emerge. He named people who had supported him. He did not express anger at the state that was about to end his life. James Mosqueda and Amy Kitchen were real people with real families. Their deaths were brutal. They deserve justice. The question that the Cantu case forces us to hold is whether the conviction that resulted from those deaths was built on testimony reliable enough to justify the ultimate, permanent consequence. Jeff Reyes said he lied. The courts said it didn't matter enough to stop the execution. Ivan Cantu is dead. Jeff Reyes's recantation remains in the public record. And the case that celebrities and campaigns could not reverse will be examined and re-examined by people who believe the wrong man died on February 28, 2024. History will either confirm Texas got this right, or it will not. There is no third option. Number 2. James Broadnax, executed March 2026. The hardest thing to sit with is not the execution. It is the confession that came after. In January 2009, Michael Galvan and Willie Grayson, both connected to the Christian music community in the Dallas area, were shot and killed in a brutal double murder that shocked a tight-knit community of faith. Both men were fathers. Both were described by those who knew them as devoted, gentle, and full of life. Their deaths left a wound in their community that has never fully healed. James Broadnax was convicted of the murders. His co-defendant was also implicated in the crimes. Evidence connected Broadnax to the scene. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. The case proceeded through years of appeals with the weight of a conviction built on witness testimony and forensic evidence. Courts reviewed and upheld the judgment. A date was set. The execution was carried out. And then, just days after James Broadnax was executed, a man came forward. That man was Broadnax's cousin. According to this individual's account, it was he, not James Broadnax, who was the actual triggerman in the murders of Michael Galvan and Willie Grayson. He alleged that Broadnax had been present, but that the responsibility for pulling the trigger lay elsewhere. Post-execution confessions and allegations are not new in the history of capital punishment. They are also not easily dismissed. Investigators and legal observers immediately noted the difficulty of the situation. The person they had convicted was dead. The person now claiming responsibility could not be prosecuted with the support of a living witness whose account could be tested against Broadnax's own. The legal and evidentiary complexity was immediate and profound. The Christian music community, already grieving, found itself holding two tragedies instead of one. Michael Galvan and Willie Grayson were gone. If the cousin's account was accurate, James Broadnax was also gone. And gone for something he may not have done, at least not in the way the state believed. At the time of this documentary's production, that claim is under review. No formal charges have been filed against the cousin. The investigation is ongoing. The families of the victims are processing an account that, if true, means the justice they believed they received was not the whole story. Broadnax's final words expressed love for his family and his faith. He went to his death insisting on his version of events.
the state proceeded with certainty it may not have been entitled to. Michael Galvan and Willie Grayson deserve truth. James Broadnax, if his cousin's account holds, deserved a trial with complete information. The execution chamber does not wait for all the facts to arrive. That is the nature of finality. That is the risk that every execution carries. And in this case, that risk may have materialized exactly as death penalty opponents always feared it would. The cousin is alive. Broadnax is not. And somewhere in that asymmetry is a failure that no amount of legal procedure can repair.
Number 1. Kimberly McCarthy, executed June 26, 2013. When the needle went into Kimberly McCarthy's arm on a hot June afternoon in 2013, the state of Texas crossed a number that no other state had ever reached. Her execution was the 500th carried out in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. 500. The crime for which she died was undeniably horrific. In 1997, Kimberly McCarthy drove to the home of her neighbor, Dorothy Booth, a retired university professor, 71 years old, a widow living alone in Lancaster, Texas. McCarthy had borrowed money from Booth before. She came back, this time for more. What happened inside Dorothy Booth's home was a violence that beggars description. McCarthy beat her. She stabbed her. In the course of the robbery, she cut off one of Booth's fingers to take the diamond ring it held. Dorothy Booth died from the injuries sustained in that attack. She was 71 years old, a woman who had lived a full and generous life, and she died in terror in her own home at the hands of someone she had tried to help. McCarthy's drug addiction was a defining feature of her background. She had struggled with crack cocaine for years. Her attorneys argued that her addiction, her background, her circumstances were mitigating factors that the jury should weigh. The jury weighed them and returned a sentence of death. The case was appealed multiple times. Among the issues raised, the racial composition of the jury that convicted her. McCarthy was black. Dorothy Booth was white. The jury that decided McCarthy's fate was all white. Her defense team raised arguments about the exclusion of black jurors from the jury pool, arguments that fit into a long, documented pattern of racial disparity in the application of the death penalty in Texas and nationally. Those arguments were reviewed and rejected by the courts. But they did not disappear. The statistics on racial disparity in capital cases are not disputed by serious researchers. The correlation between the race of the victim, the race of the defendant, and the likelihood of a death sentence is documented and consistent. Whether it was operative in Kimberly McCarthy's case specifically is a question that was not resolved to the satisfaction of her advocates. Anti-death penalty activists gathered outside the Huntsville unit on the afternoon of June 26, 2013. They held signs. They marked the 500th execution with the kind of solemnity that attaches to round numbers. Not because the 500th death is more significant than the 499th or the 501st, but because human beings mark milestones and ask themselves what the milestone means. Inside, McCarthy was calm. She addressed the witnesses in the room. Her final words expressed love for her family. She expressed sorrow for Dorothy Booth's family. She said she was going to a better place. She was pronounced dead at 6:37 p.m. Dorothy Booth's family had also gathered. They had waited 16 years for that moment. By most accounts, they did not celebrate. They mourned. They had been mourning since 1997. Kimberly McCarthy's number was 500. The number above the door at the walls is not a counter. There is no scoreboard. The state does not mark these milestones. But the people who oppose what happens inside that building marked it. They stood outside and counted 500 executions in one state in less than 4 decades. Whether that is justice administered at scale or something else entirely is the question that the number 500 demands we ask. And that question does not have a clean answer. It has only the facts that surround it, the families it has touched on all sides, and the permanent, irreversible nature of what was done 500 times in the name of the people of Texas. 10 cases, 10 executions, across decades, across crimes that ranged from the historically unique to the internationally condemned to the deeply, deeply uncertain. What do they tell us taken together? They tell us that the death penalty is not applied uniformly, that the quality of a person's legal representation is directly correlated with their likelihood of dying for a crime, that forensic science has changed since many of these convictions, and that some of what put people in the death chamber has since been discredited, that witnesses lie, that witnesses recant, that the appeals process does not always catch what it was designed to catch. They tell us that some of the people who have died in that chamber in Huntsville were undeniably guilty of acts of profound, indefensible cruelty. They tell us that others, Cameron Todd Willingham most prominently, but not only, carried their uncertainty with them to the end. They tell us that families of victims do not all want the same thing, that some find peace in execution and some do not, that grief does not follow a single path, and justice does not look the same to everyone who has lost someone. They tell us that the state, when it acts with finality, had better be certain, because there is no mechanism, no law, no court, and no executive order that can reverse an execution that turns out to have been wrong. Each of the 10 people in this documentary was once a child. Each had a name before they had a crime. Each case began in tragedy, a victim's life taken, and ended in another room, on another table, with another needle, watched by witnesses on both sides who were all, in different ways, trying to make sense of what justice requires. We do not end this documentary with an answer. We end it with the only honest thing we have. Texas has executed more people than any other state in America. Whether that makes it the most just or the most dangerous depends entirely on who you ask.